Welcome, everyone, to the May Walk Massachusetts Network event. I'm going to turn it over to our speaker, Sarah Presley, now. Sarah?
All right, without any further ado. Okay, so we will go ahead and we will get started with this presentation, which is PROWAG, which stands for Public Right-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines, and it is going to be on pedestrian access route basics. And as I will mention later, really, the pedestrian access route is the backbone of PROWAG. But let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So before we get into the presentation proper, a bit about the U.S. Access Board's mission. Now, as Brendan mentioned just a second ago, I am Sarah Presley. I am an accessibility specialist at the Access Board, and I work on issues dealing with buildings and facilities and public right-of-way. And at the Access Board, we establish accessibility guidelines and standards. What we really do is we develop guidelines that may or may not become enforceable standards. So some of the guidelines that we developed the Americans with Disabilities Act guidelines, which became the ADA standards. And we developed the Architectural Barriers Act guidelines, which became the Architectural Barriers Act standards. And we developed these public right-of-way accessibility guidelines that we will be talking about today. And then we provide technical assistance and training on the guidelines that we helped to develop. And finally, the Access Board enforces the ABA standards or the Architectural Barriers Act standards. And these standards apply to federal facilities. These are the only standards that we actually have any authority to enforce. Next slide. And with that, let's go ahead and get started talking about PROWAG, starting with application and scoping. And this will tell us what is covered and to what extent. Next slide. So we're going to move on to talk about the purpose of PROWAG. So the purpose of these guidelines is to ensure that pedestrian facilities located in the public right-of-way are readily accessible to and usable by pedestrians with disabilities. It's as simple as that. Now, these guidelines, as they are guidelines at the moment, they will become enforceable standards as part of the ADA or the ABA standards when standard setting agencies such as the Department of Justice or the Department of Transportation adopt them as standards. So right now, they're technically still guidelines. This is our final version of the guidelines. We are waiting now to have the standard setting agencies adopt them as part of the ADA standards so that they will be enforceable standards. But as I go through this presentation, I will be saying requirements as if they are already standards. It's just kind of easier to do that. But at the moment, they are technically still guidelines. It is also possible that some states will adopt them into their, accessibility codes, and I cannot say which states have done that. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, and we'll talk about the scope of coverage. So all newly constructed pedestrian facilities and all altered portions of existing pedestrian facilities for pedestrian circulation and use located in the public right-of-way must comply with these requirements. There is an exception. Pedestrian facilities within vaults, tunnels, and other spaces that are used only by service personnel for maintenance or for repair or for monitoring of equipment are not required to comply with these standards or guidelines or requirements. Next slide. Now, these requirements do apply to temporary and permanent pedestrian facilities, and they apply to permanent and temporary pedestrian facilities and elements in the public right-of-way. And some examples of coverage for temporary facilities include that where a pedestrian circulation path or where a transit stop is temporarily closed by construction, maintenance operations, or similar conditions, an alternate pedestrian access route or an alternate transit stop must be provided. So those are temporary facilities, and we do have requirements in the PROWAG. They're more limited requirements, but this just goes to show that we do cover temporary and permanent facilities with these guidelines. Next slide. And now let's talk about new construction versus alteration. So I mentioned that newly constructed and altered portions of pedestrian facilities and elements have to comply with these. So new construction is construction of pedestrian facilities on undeveloped land. It's basically what they call greenfield. So new construction is really, if you go out into a green field somewhere and there's no pedestrian facilities and you start building them, that is what's considered new construction. So elements and facilities that are added to existing developed public right-of-way are not required to comply as new construction. Next slide. On to alterations. So first, I'll start with a couple of relevant definitions. So alteration or altered is a change to or an addition of a pedestrian facility in an existing developed public right-of-way that affects or could affect pedestrian access, circulation, or usability. And since we talked about a developed right-of-way, we have a definition for developed. Something that's developed is something that's containing buildings, pedestrian facilities, roadways, utilities, or elements that basically things that are already existing. It's considered to be developed already, and we're talking about alterations as opposed to new construction. Next slide. Now we're going to talk about existing physical constraints. So in alterations where, hold on just a second. Yeah, okay. So we're going to talk about existing physical constraints. So in alterations where existing physical constraints make compliance with applicable requirements technically infeasible, compliance is required to the maximum extent feasible. So basically, with alterations, since you have things that are existing already, you may not be able to comply with the requirements fully, but you have to comply as much as possible to the maximum extent that is feasible. And one reason you might not be able to comply fully is because you have some of these existing physical constraints. And existing physical constraints can include, but are not limited to, underlying terrain, underground structures, adjacent developed facilities, drainage, or the presence of a significant natural or historic feature. So these are all reasons why there might be an issue with complying fully with the requirements when you're talking about doing, altering a portion of the public right-of-way. Next slide. Now let's talk about connection to alterations in connection to a pedestrian circulation path. So where pedestrian facilities are altered, they must be connected by a pedestrian access route to an existing pedestrian circulation path, and a transitional segment may be used in this connection. And of course, we have a definition for a transitional segment since we talk about it here, and that is the portion of a pedestrian circulation path that connects adjacent surfaces with different slopes or dimensions to provide a smooth transition. So the idea here is that if you alter a portion of a sidewalk, there's obviously going to be part of the sidewalk that hasn't been altered, and there needs to be a smooth transition between the altered part and the unaltered part. So that's why we're talking about here that you have to connect it with a pedestrian access route, basically have a transition segment to do that. Okay, next slide. And now we are going to move on from basic scoping to pedestrian access routes. And a pedestrian access route is the backbone of PROWAG. And this is mainly what I'm going to be covering here. I'll be going over some of the basic characteristics of the pedestrian access route and also talking about some components of pedestrian access routes. But this is mainly what I'm going to cover today. PROWAG has lots of other stuff that covers parking and transit stops and some other things, but we're just going to get into the basics here, the very basic part of it, which is the pedestrian access route. Okay, next slide. So first, we will start with a definition and where the pedestrian access route is required. So the definition is an accessible, continuous, and unobstructed path of travel for use by pedestrians with disabilities within a pedestrian circulation path. That is a pedestrian access route. And where are they required? Pedestrian access routes must be provided within pedestrian circulation paths, and these would include sidewalks and shared use paths. And while we're on that subject, we'll define shared use path, which is a multi-use path designed primarily for use by bicyclists, pedestrians, and other authorized, motorized, and non-motorized users for transportation purposes, but may also be used for recreation. And shared use paths are physically separated from motor vehicle traffic by an open space or by barrier, and are either within the highway or some other public right of way. And I'm just going to point out here that the PROWAG does not have as many requirements for shared use paths as people might think. I will mention a couple of them today, but there are very few, not nearly as many as people ask us questions about. Next slide. Okay, so now I'm going to get into some of the basic characteristics or technical requirements for a pedestrian access route, and I'm going to start with continuous clear width. The route needs to be wide enough for people to use. So the basic requirement is a 48-inch minimum continuous clear width, exclusive of the width of any curb. Now, where the pedestrian access route is less than 60 inches wide, passing spaces are required every 200 feet. And those passing spaces have to be 60 by 60. So a lot of places have gone ahead and decided to make their state or local requirements that the pedestrian access route has to be 60 inches wide, so they don't have to worry about putting in those passing spaces. Now, within medians and pedestrian refuge islands, the clear width is 60 inches minimum, and where shared use paths cross medians and pedestrian refuge islands, the required clear width is 60 inches minimum, or at least as wide as the crosswalk which leads to that pedestrian refuge island, whichever is greater. Okay, and on shared use paths, the pedestrian access route must extend the full width of the pedestrian circulation path. So for shared use paths, the minimum clear width is the entire shared use path. Next slide. And now we want the pedestrian access route to not be too steep, so we're going to talk about grade, which is the steepness in the direction of travel. So the maximum grade of a pedestrian access route is 5%. It can have a 5% slope, except where the grade established for the adjacent street exceeds 5%, the grade of the pedestrian access route can match the grade that is established for that adjacent street. Next slide. And now we'll talk about grade of the pedestrian access route within crosswalks. So the maximum grade of the pedestrian access route within a crosswalk is still supposed to be 5%, but there is an exception where roadway design requires super elevation greater than 5%. At the crosswalk, the grade of the pedestrian access route within the crosswalk may be the same as the super elevation. Next slide. And on to on to cross slope, which is basically the steepness of the pedestrian access route in the direction that is perpendicular to the direction of travel, which obviously you don't want your route tilting perpendicular to the direction of travel too much. So we're going to talk about cross slope, and we're going to start with the cross slope of the pedestrian access route that is not within a crosswalk. So the maximum cross slope for that is 2.1%. We're trying to keep it as flat as possible, but we allow a little bit of slope for drainage. But there is an exception. The portion of the pedestrian access route that is within a street that is connecting an accessible parallel on-street parking space to the nearest crosswalk is not required to have a maximum cross slope of 2.1%. And we're not going to get too much into parking today, but with the parallel parking spaces, you do have to ultimately connect them to a pedestrian access route. And in the process of doing that, to get them to the crosswalk, you don't have to meet that cross slope requirement. Next slide. And now on to cross slope of pedestrian access route that is within crosswalk. So this depends on the type of crosswalk. For crosswalks with yield or stop control devices, the cross slope is 2.1%, same as what's required just in general for the, or max just in general for the regular pedestrian access route. Now, for a crosswalk with an uncontrolled approach, the cross slope can be as much as 5% maximum. And for a crosswalk with a traffic control signal or a pedestrian hybrid beacon, the cross slope can be as much as 5% also. And for mid-block and roundabout crosswalks, the cross slope must be no greater than the street grade of that street that is going through that mid-block crosswalk. Next slide. And now we're going to talk about grade breaks and changes in level. You don't want to have major abrupt changes in level in your pedestrian access route. That would make it really difficult for people using wheelchairs. So grade breaks must be flush. And for changes in level, there can be, kind of abrupt changes in level up to a half an inch. And the first is, so you can have up to a half an inch of an abrupt change in level. You can have up to a 1/4 inch of an abrupt change in level that is vertical. If you're going on up to a half an inch, you can have that second half, like if you could have the first 1/4 of that change in level vertical. The second 1/4 of that half inch would have to be would have to be beveled with a slope no greater than 50%, or you could have the entire half inch beveled with a slope no greater than 50%. But basically, that's the requirement. You really are. We're trying not to have any abrupt changes in level that are more than half an inch. Next slide. So now we're going to talk about changes in level that are in fact greater than a half an inch. So changes in level that are greater than a half an inch up to 6 inches must have a slope no greater than 8.3%. So this would be like if you had a step down on your sidewalk or something like that, and it was like 5 inches. Ultimately, they're going to have to do something to basically bridge that change in level, like a little ramp thing. And its slope can be no greater than 8.3%, and that is in fact the maximum slope for regular ramps. And here I'm not talking about curb ramps. I'm just talking about, other kinds of step downs on the pedestrian access route. So up to 6 inches, it has to have a slope no greater than 8.3%, and changes in level that are greater than 6 inches must comply with all ramp requirements. So up to 6 inches, they only have to comply with the ramp requirement of the slope. If the change in level, if you have a step up that's like 7 or 8 inches on your pedestrian access route, it has to comply with all ramp requirements, which would include providing handrails and edge protection. But for sidewalk, there's a big exception to there's a big exception for this because and we really are talking about abrupt changes in level here, because with in the public right of way, if your sidewalk in general it can be steeper than 8.3% if your road is steeper than that, if the adjacent road has an established grade that's steeper than that. But I'm not going to get too much into that today. But just to suffice it to say that we're trying to avoid abrupt changes in level in the pedestrian access route. Next slide. And also, we don't want to have big horizontal openings in our pedestrian access route either. So horizontal openings in ground surfaces, such as those in gratings and joints, must not allow passage of a sphere that is larger than a half an inch in diameter. And except where multiple directions of travel intersect, elongated openings are actually permitted, but they must be placed so that the long dimension is perpendicular to the dominant direction of travel. And there are other requirements for flangeway gaps, which we will not get into today. Next slide. And now we're going to move on to talk about curb ramps, blended transitions, and crosswalks. And these are all definitely components of pedestrian access routes. Next slide. So first, I'm going to give some practical definition here. PROWAG has some more complicated definitions for these, but I'm going to simplify things a bit. So first, a curb ramp is a sloped connection cut through or built up to a curb, generally with a slope that is between 5% and 8.3%, though there are some exceptions. A blended transition is a sloped transition from a curb with a slope that is less than or equal to 5%, and which may wrap around a corner. And finally, a crosswalk is where pedestrians are intended or expected to cross the street. It really is as simple as that, even though we have a much more complicated definition in the PROWAG. Next slide. Okay, now a bit about requirements for curb ramps and for blended transitions at crosswalks. So one curb ramp or blended transition must be provided for each crosswalk, or a single blended transition that spans all crosswalks at an intersection corner may be provided. Now, in alterations, a single curb ramp is permitted at the apex of the intersection corner. Now, most blind people like myself don't love this, but it's been around. It's been a requirement. It's been around for a long time, and we have not gotten rid of it. Okay. Now, at a mid-block or roundabout crosswalk, curb ramps or blended transitions must be provided on both ends of the crosswalk. Now, we do specifically say this in PROWAG, although I'm not 100% sure why, because to be for sure, if you have a crosswalk, you have to have a curb ramp on both ends, regardless of whether it's a mid-block, roundabout, or just a crosswalk at a regular intersection. Next slide. Now, I'm going to talk about where crossing is prohibited. So where crossing is prohibited, or where you're just not intending for people to cross, sometimes people say, well, people cross there, but we really don't intend them to cross. Where, so do we cross at a certain spot? So do we really have to do anything? Well, if you don't intend people to cross there, there are some things that need to be done. First of all, curb ramps must not be provided, and the pedestrian circulation path must be separated from the roadway, either with landscaping or other non-prepared surface, or by a detectable vertical edge treatment with a bottom edge that is 15 inches maximum above the pedestrian circulation path. So this would be somebody like such as myself who is blind. If I'm walking along a sidewalk and I get to the end of the sidewalk, or maybe where you could turn, if the sidewalk keeps going and I get to a curb, I might think that I could cross there, even if there isn't a curb ramp. But we're making it clear here that you have to make it clear that crossing is not intended by like having the sidewalk separated from the curb with grass or with this vertical edge treatment. So it makes it obvious that crossing is not intended. Next slide. Okay, now while we are on the subject of curb ramps, a few things about detectable warnings. So detectable warnings are required on blended transitions and curb ramps at crosswalks. And we have a new requirement: pedestrian circulation paths at driveways controlled with yield or stop control devices or traffic signals must have detectable warnings. This used to just be an advisory in the previous guidelines. It is now a requirement. Next slide. Okay, now we're going to talk about detectable warnings at pedestrian refuge islands. And one thing I want to say here before that I neglected to put in the slide is that when you have detectable warnings, like on a curb ramp, you have to have at least 24 inches of detectable warning surface in the direction of travel. Now, at a cut-through pedestrian refuge island, detectable warnings must be located no greater than 6 inches from the edges of the pedestrian refuge island or at the back of curb, and they must be separated by a 24-inch minimum length of surface in the direction of travel without detectable warnings. And in order to meet this separation requirement, we needed a definition for a pedestrian refuge island. So it is a defined area that is 72 inches long minimum in the direction of travel, located between traffic lanes for pedestrian refuge within a median, a splitter island, or a channelized island. Now, the idea here is that the pedestrian access, if you're going to call something a pedestrian refuge island, it needs to have enough distance in the direction of travel so that you can have two sets of detectable warnings on that. So if, like I say, as a blind person, I start to cross the street, I go down the detectable warnings for the curb ramp, cross the street, and I get to the pedestrian refuge island and I find detectable warnings there. Now, if there's only one set of detectable warnings there. When I pass those, I may think that I have gotten to the edge of the other, to the end of the street. In fact, I might think that I'm done crossing the street, when in fact I could be launching out into another side of the street beyond the pedestrian refuge island. So the idea here is that you need a pedestrian refuge island that's big enough to have some separation so that you can have the detectable warnings going onto the pedestrian refuge island, have some separation, and have the detectable warnings going off of the pedestrian refuge island. If your pedestrian refuge island is narrower or less than 72 inches in the direction of travel, there should not be detectable warnings on it. Next slide. Now, where detectable warnings are not required, detectable warnings are not required on curb ramps or blended transitions that are used exclusively to connect on-street parking access aisles to the pedestrian access route or to connect passenger loading zone access aisles to the pedestrian access route. We don't require detectable warnings for every single thing that looks like a curb ramp. Next slide. Okay, so now that we have talked about crosswalks and curb ramps, let's talk about how some requirements that can help people who are blind to get across the street. And these requirements are under the heading of basically accessible pedestrian signals, or APSs. Next slide. So first, the definition of an accessible pedestrian signal. So these are devices that communicate information about pedestrian signal timing in non-visual formats such as audible tones or speech messages and vibrating surfaces. Next slide. So when we're talking about accessible pedestrian signals, there are two types of devices that have requirements in PROWAG, and those are traffic control devices with pedestrian signal heads and pedestrian activated warning devices. And we will start with the definition and requirements for traffic signal devices with pedestrian signal heads. So a pedestrian signal head, for anybody who doesn't know, is the device containing the walking person symbol and the upraised hand symbol symbolizing don't walk, that is installed to direct pedestrian traffic at a crosswalk. And another relevant definition here is also the definition for a pedestrian hybrid beacon. And this is a special type of hybrid beacon that is used to warn and control traffic at an unsignalized location to assist pedestrians in crossing the street at a marked crosswalk. So basically, the pedestrian hybrid beacon turns the intersection into a signalized intersection when a pedestrian pushes its button. So both the pedestrian hybrid beacons actually do have pedestrian signal heads in them, and when somebody pushes the button, it basically acts like a signalized intersection. Okay, next slide. Okay, so now on to the requirements for these pedestrian signal heads. So where traffic control signals or hybrid beacons with pedestrian signal heads are provided at the crosswalks, accessible pedestrian signals are required, and the requirements for these are that a pedestrian push button or passive detection to activate the accessible features has to be provided. So you have to have a button so somebody can push, and also a locator tone, maybe if there's no passive detection, so that they can find that button. And where applicable, this push button would activate the walk interval if the button just activates the walk interval for anybody. Okay, and the main accessible feature for these types of devices is the audible and vibrotactile walk indication. So for pedestrian signal heads, you have to have an accessible pedestrian signal. So when you push the button, when the walk interval starts timing, you get an audible and a vibrotactile indication that you can walk. Next slide. Now, there are more limited requirements for pedestrian activated warning devices. So these are devices installed in conjunction with a warning sign that are activated to alert vehicle operators to the presence of a pedestrian. And an example of a pedestrian activated warning device is one of those rectangular rapid flashing beacons. next slide. Now, the pedestrian activated warning device requirements are that where the pedestrian activated warning devices are provided, accessible pedestrian signals are required that have, again, they have to have that push button or that passive detection to activate the accessible features of the signal. And the main accessible feature for this type of signal is a speech message indicating the status of the beacon. And this is in lieu of an audible or vibrotactile walk indication, because of course these pedestrian activated warning devices do not actually have a walk indication. They're kind of warning the driver that somebody wants to cross, but as a pedestrian, I never know when, that they never are completely required to stop. So I'm supposed to get a speech message telling me the status of that beacon, and then I just have to decide when to cross and pray. Okay, and with that, I am pretty much finished with the presentation part of this. We do have 4 more slides here that have information about more PROWAG training that's on our YouTube channel, as well as information about our technical guides and how you can contact us to get technical assistance. And so Brendan can definitely give everybody these slides who has attended this meeting. So you will have all that information, have how to get in touch with us, how to get additional training. And with that, I guess we can open it up for questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah. So feel free to either raise your hand and I can call on you if you have a question for Sarah, or you can put a question in the chat and I can read it to Sarah as well. But Sarah, I'm so glad you brought up the piece about the RRFBs, because that is definitely something that I'm seeing if she's on or not. That is definitely something that I've heard from at least one participant who has been on these calls before. Meg, she has brought up that RRFBs don't currently have the accessible speech message letting visually impaired people know that the beacons are on, and that a lot of the new installations of those do not have it. So is that
I have never seen one. I'm blind myself, and I have never encountered one. Now, granted, I go out of my way to avoid things
Sure.
like roundabouts where they have these types of signals, but I've never seen one. And the requirement is that as new ones come online now, and I did say that these things, that the PROWAG is still guidelines at this point, but at some point they will be adopted as enforceable standards under the ADA and the Architectural Barriers Act. And when they are, then when these new rapid flashing beacons come on, then there's going to have to be a speech message that indicates the status of the beacon. Now, we've gotten some pushback because at the moment we don't say what that status message has to be. And, it is unfortunate that we don't have a standardized message for that. And maybe there needs to be some research to get a standardized message, but they're going to have to put one, put some kind of message there to let me know if it's yellow or flashing or red or whatever.
Yeah, like yellow lights are flashing, lights.
Right. And it may require that when they do that, in a city, as a person who's blind, I'm going to have to get a little bit of education to find out, well, what does that mean? But I'll get that education, and then that will at least help. I'll at least know when the drivers, what the drivers are seeing, and when at least there's less of a chance that I'm going to get hit trying to step out there and cross.
Great. Okay. There's a couple hands up, so I'll call on Carol first. Carol.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much. I'm on the board of WalkMass, but I'm also a wheelchair user, and I'm also on the subcommittee for the Massachusetts Architectural Access Board with Debbie Ryan, who was on your board, and we're working on the regulations here. And in answer to your sort of question about state, that have adopted this. My memory, and it was a while ago, is that we adopted PROAG we adopted it. However, like you, we have to go through a lot of hoops to get it, get our regulations adopted. It's just a long,
Right,
long.
and you may have to, and you may have adopted the previous version, you know,
No,
before
I
this
think
final
we,
rule came out, or
I
you
think
already
only,
adopted the final one.
yeah, because Debbie
Okay.
brought it to our attention. So, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, but we have a long ways to go. Anyway, but I just want to say we're on the road about that.
Okay.
I guess my question, I should know this, but is
Hopefully I'll know it.
is jurisdiction. I mean, does this only govern obviously new construction, right?
It does govern new construction, which is pretty rare in the public right of way these days.
Yes.
But it also governs, you know, alteration. If you're altering portions of public right of way, it covers that as well.
Do you have to be doing the alterations to a certain degree? I mean, like our regs only kick in when you have 30% of the value of the property. Then
Nope, we don't have anything like that. We don't say, you know, there used to be the previous iteration of PROAG used to say something about, you know, the scope of the project and, you know, had more language like that. But now we just say, if you touch it, it has to comply with the requirements to the maximum extent feasible, period. That is the requirement that is in the Americans with Disabilities Act standards, you know, that apply to buildings and facilities and routes on sites.
but if you touch one end of the access of the path, does that mean the rest of it has
No,
to?
you're not necessarily going to have to, you know, not necessarily going to have to do the whole block. And that's going to be really interesting. It's going to be really interesting to see when the Department of Justice and the Department of Transportation adopt these things as enforceable standards, if they say any more about that. I mean, right now it's basically like you say, well, we're going to replace, you know, we've got this really cracked up, messed up piece of sidewalk. We're going to replace it. Well, the PROAG now would basically say that when whatever that little section is that you replace, you've got to make it comply to the maximum extent feasible with, you know, surface requirements, with the width, with slope, whatever. And then you've got to provide a connection to the unaltered part that's, you know, as smooth as you can, so that you don't have some crazy abrupt transition between the altered part and the unaltered part. But we don't say, you know, we really have nothing that says, you know, if you do half the block, you bought the whole block or anything like that.
Okay. I don't want to hog, but I mean, my last question was, what does it look like the Department of Justice is going to adopt them?
Well,
or what's in, yeah.
I probably should have put a link in here. I didn't know if the audience would be into this or not, but there's the current regulatory agenda, and you can go and look at that and see what they're thinking about, what they're planning to do. And I think right now the current regulatory agenda for justice, I think it said that they were thinking about planning to put out an NPRM, or notice of proposed rulemaking, to adopt PROAG in June, but I could be wrong about that. I would really have to go back and look.
Okay.
But that's but you know, that's the closest that we can get, is to look at that current regulatory agenda and see what they're saying in their table, where they talk about all the different things that they're doing and what they're proposing. That doesn't mean that they will do it. You know, I can't remember if justice was June or the fall. I really can't remember. But even if they put it in the current regulatory agenda, you can't hold them to it. It is absolutely not carved in stone. So we really don't know when it's going to happen.
Okay, thank you.
All right, it looks like Betsy had her hand up next.
Oh, well, my question sort of builds on this in terms of is most of this then gonna just rest on the fact that consultants and departments of DPWs and stuff somehow learn about these and willingly follow this? Or what is envisioned that it's ever going to be enforced? And then maybe I'll even put Tracy on the spot, and to what extent is UMass Transportation Center thinking about doing educationals for folks about this?
Well, right now they're guidelines. So there's no federal enforcement at the moment, I don't think. I don't think that the Federal Highway Administration or anybody like that is, no federal agencies adopted. So if your state adopts it as in their codes, then they would be able to enforce what they adopt as their own standards. When it is adopted by the Department of Transportation or Department of Justice, it's probably at that point, unless something is different than the regular ADA, basically the way the ADA works right now is that enforcement is based for the most part on complaints. I mean, I've heard about the Department of Justice going and just looking at places and seeing problems and, getting into settlement agreements with jurisdictions. But for the most part, the way the ADA works is that if you, as a person with a disability, go somewhere and you see a problem, you can file a complaint. Now, if it's a problem in a government agency, like a Title II entity, like at a government office, you can get in touch with the ADA coordinator for your area and try to get them to do something about it, and maybe the city will fix it. But enforcement is really based on complaints for the ADA, and unless something changes, that's going to be federal enforcement of PROWAG is going to be that too, unless the Department of Transportation may have more solid enforcement than just waiting for people to complain. But I really am not sure what that's going to look like.
So we're very dependent on hopefully some good education and people's willingness to then follow.
But Betsy, if it does get adopted by the Massachusetts Architectural Access Board, we'll have enforcement ability.
Yeah, see, that's what we hope. Is y'all go ahead and adopt it. You will adopt it more quickly than DOJ and DOT probably.
Yes,
and
also it's a better board. We have a better active board, but we just have to get it there. So I can explain all that to you, Betsy, later. The process.
That's great. Massachusetts is good.
We are, yeah.
Great. It looks like Rick had his hand up.
Hi, everybody. This is Rick Alberg out in Provincetown. I was glad you talked about the sidewalk question and the resurfacing sidewalks and whatnot, because we have a project going on right now where they are resurfacing a street, a short street, but a street in the center of town, and they are resurfacing the sidewalk as well. And there's a mid-block crossing that comes up to that sidewalk that has no ramp. And I've asked many times if we can have a ramp put there, and I get pushback from our public works and from our ADA coordinator that, oh, we can't do that. And it's been in that condition for at least a decade. So I'm wondering, I mean, they're putting in a shiny new brick sidewalk and completely resurfaced roadway. It just seems like this is such a huge missed opportunity.
I think the DOJ, I would have to go back and look, but I think it sounds like they're triggering putting in a curb ramp with the work that they're doing based on the sidewalk and the resurfacing of the road. I would have to go look, but it sounds like they definitely have done enough to trigger putting in a curb ramp.
So what's the approach? You said it's a very complaint based. So what is the approach that a local advocate should do to actually get some traction on this? I mean, they're actually in construction right now. It's obvious they're not going to do it. And, someone's got to be the squeaky wheel here. Do I go to the Architectural Access Board, or I've already talked?
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like it.
Yes, yes. Rick, if you want, you can contact me, but yes. And I don't know for sure that they'll have jurisdiction over this, but that's a good place to start with a complaint.
Okay. Because I think it's just often so unclear to folks who are advocates. We have a local disability commission they just seem so out of the loop on being able to get particularly sidewalk improvements made accessible when those projects happen. And now that we have a complete streets policy in place, a lot of improvements are happening because there's a lot of funding for those things, but we're getting apex ramps and, things that folks who are disabled don't really want to use. They would like the state-of-the-art PROWAG compliant stuff, and we're just not seeing great design. So hopefully some level of education with
I will always say that, if you've got a good, architectural access board in your state, and it's somebody that's really looking at the code and trying to enforce the code or educate people about the code, that is always where you want to go first.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Federal enforcement is slow.
I will reach out to you, Carol. I had one more question.
Yeah,
I know
please.
that PROWAG doesn't address bicycle facilities at all, but there's a situation where we're starting to see more pedestrian and bicycle crossings that are immediately adjacent to one another. So they're right side by side. And I was wondering if there is any guidance in PROWAG around doing some kind of perpendicular raised device like a detectable warning. They use those a lot in Europe, and I don't know if any of that is in PROWAG to provide some separation so that folks don't veer off into the bicycle zone and in a crosswalk.
There really isn't yet. There is some discussion. I mean, and I haven't gotten so much the question about the crossings, but even just, you know, where they decide to separate have a pedestrian circulation path right next to a bike lane, you know, and
right.
How do you get separation with that? And we absolutely, you know, don't want people using truncated domes for that, which is the detectable warnings that you use to let somebody know that they're going, you know, from the pedestrian way to the vehicular way. There is some discussion, or there has been a little bit of research done on tactile warning indicator surfaces. I'm not sure if I'm getting that exactly right, where they're talking about using kind of little trapezoidal strip things. So it's a different type of detectable warning to let somebody know that there's like a boundary that they don't want to cross, you know, because there could be bikes there. But there's nothing about that in PROWAG. We don't have anything about that yet.
Okay,
in
great.
PROWAG,
Thank you very much.
unfortunately.
This has been incredibly helpful for kind of moving advocacy along and getting a better understanding. I've been to several of these PROWAG seminars that you folks have been doing, and it takes a while to process this. It's so super complicated.
Oh, it's a lot. Yeah.
So thank you for doing this, and thank you to WalkMass for making this happen. It's really, really helpful.
Great. Next up is Lindsay.
Hi. Thank you, Sarah, for the presentation. It was really informative, and I just had two quick questions also related to detectable warning panels with regards to kind of refuge islands versus medians, and as well as at driveways that you had identified, like yield and stop control devices require detectable warning panels, but at like industrial or commercial driveways that see a high volume and a really wide crossing, are detectable warning panels recommended at those locations, or is it different?
Yeah, it might be a good recommendation. They're not required if they don't have, you know, stop or yield control or the traffic signals. But if you know that there's a big traffic volume there, it could be, you know, it could be a good recommendation to put them there.
Okay, but definitely it's not a requirement, but could be recommended or preferred.
Yes.
Okay. And then the second one was with regards to like a median. So we have median widths that are at least 6 feet wide and definitely fit the 24-inch detectable warning panels on either side with the 24-inch separation between the two. However, they're not necessarily required as a pedestrian refuge island in terms of the crossing timing. So like the intent is not that it's a pedestrian refuge island, but it could be a pedestrian refuge island.
Right. No.
Is it recommended to use detectable warning panels?
No, not if it's not timed as such. That's the problem with doing one of these half-an-hour presentations. You can't say everything. No, if it's really a pedestrian refuge island, it kind of needs to be timed as such. And certainly, and that's one thing that I didn't say about the accessible pedestrian signals, is that if you have it, so like if you have your pedestrian, your accessible pedestrian signal when you're about to cross the street, and then you get to a pedestrian refuge island, if it's timed, you know, so that thing can be a refuge island and you can wait there to cross again, then there has to be a pedestrian accessible pedestrian signal at the refuge island as well to let somebody go to cross. So yeah, I mean, you know, you definitely don't have to have the detectable warnings there if it's just if the intention is for people to just go, and the timing is such that they should just go, you know, then, you know, and not wait. You're not putting separate timing for those two sides or whatever.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I guess one more as kind of a combination of the two. As like a kind of like a mall entrance in and out. There's no stop or yield. Well, not necessarily a mall entrance, but another large driveway. There's no stop or yield control necessarily, but there is, again, kind of like a median separating the two entrance and exit of this driveway. Would detectable warning panels be useful in that situation as well? Because that one doesn't have timing, or would it kind of be treated the same as?
You know, it's interesting. I've never really thought about that. Probably not.
Okay.
I mean, I assume you don't, and you don't, do you have it split some way? Like you step up or, you know, like you're a curb, or is it just, you just have the 2 lanes, you know, coming in and out?
Just the 2 lanes coming in and out. And it would not have a ramp as well. It would be a
No,
raised sidewalk.
No, I wouldn't think you'd put detectable warnings there.
Okay.
I don't think so.
This was very helpful. Thank you so much.
Great. I think we have one more question. Don has his hand up.
I was going to ask a question, but I got it answered already in the discussion. But I did also want to make a comment that as far as the current PROWAG, Mass Trails grants adopted that as of the first of the year. And so in Massachusetts, at least, if you're going to go for one of those grants, you need to employ PROWAG as it currently is written.
All right.
That's good information. Thanks
Y'all
for
are on the ball.
thanks for sharing that, Don. Yeah.
Yeah.
Carol, looks
Yeah.
like you raised your hand one more time.
I did because of what Don said. It reminded me when you said that for an undeveloped land, you know, if they're putting in a trails in an undeveloped spot, that it doesn't apply. But I have a house and there's a woodsy area and they're building trails and they are building accessible trails, but they don't have to.
Well, trails are a little different. Right now we don't really have any kind of requirements for trails. I mean, if you're talking like a hiking trail or a walking trail that's like in the woods or something like that, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are requirements. There are no requirements for that in PROAG. I mean, unless it's like a shared use path for bicycling and walking, then it might get shared use path and get picked up. Maybe, and it would kind of depend on where it is. But for like a trail through the woods, there are requirements, some very minimal requirements for trails in the Architectural Barriers Act standards. Those only apply on federal lands. They could be used for best practices, but at the moment they're not really required. So then it just kind of falls into, if it's like a city trail or something like that, what are you going to do to provide program access to it? And you know, it's a little tricky because there aren't, you know, that's, you know, you have the ADA standards that say, or the ADA regulations that say that things have to be accessible. And then you're like, well, how do you do that? And so that's why we have these design standards that give you the requirements for it. But unfortunately, we don't really have design standards for everything yet that are enforceable. And trails is kind of one of those areas. And if you have a particular question about a trail, we might be able to think about whether it's a shared use path or not, and whether PROAG, it would get picked up by PROAG that way.
All right, like Don, you raised your hand. Do you have a follow-up on that?
Yeah, I wanted to say that there was at the Mass Trails Conference for 2017, and you can find the slides over there. There was a presentation on all the various regs for hiking trails and the like that involve accessibility. And now, of course, there's a new program in DCR that requires DCR parks to look at expanding their trails and guidance, and they've just put together guidance for what they view as a accessible dirt path or trail. So there is some data out there that's not, it's complex. I would love to see the access board or someone take it all and give me a way that I could go, okay, I'm going to be crossing US Forest Service land or state park land or this land. What do I have to do? Because right now you have to go through 5 different standards.
Right. Well, if you're crossing U.S. Forest Service land, if it's federal land, then it may have to comply with the trail requirements that are in the Architectural Barriers Act standards. Those are fairly minimal, though. You know, it really. I mean, I don't know about how much you've looked at them. I'm sure people with disabilities would like more on those trails.
Everybody would like more, but yeah,
you know,
but just figuring out who's doing what is hard.
Right. Yeah.
Thanks, Don.
Great. Well, if there are no other questions, Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been fantastic.
Righty. You're
Yeah,
welcome.
and I'll make sure to send out those slides to everyone so
Yeah,
Sarah's
send out
information.
because they have our contact information on them, and you can always email us or call us with questions. We're really responsive.
Perfect.
So,
Thank you, Sarah. And also thank you, Carol, for suggesting this talk and putting us in touch with the US Access Board. So if other people have ideas for talks in the future, or if you want to share about something you're doing, please let us know. We'd love to have you as one of our monthly speakers. So, all right. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, Brendan.